John had been driving along the lonely roads of Wyoming for more than 7 hours, a route he had taken countless times before, but that night seemed different. The sky was covered in dark, dense clouds, without a single star in sight. The absence of the moon left everything around him plunged into an almost palpable darkness. The constant sound of the truck's engine and the roar of the wind were John's only companions in that silent vastness. Concentrating on the road ahead, he slowly began to feel tired. His eyes were heavy, and his hands on the steering wheel became more tense with every kilometer. The absolute isolation was suffocating. John was used to long journeys, but the lack of any other vehicles that night made the landscape even more desolate. The asphalt seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the only thing he could focus on was moving forward. Suddenly, something caught his attention. On the dark horizon, the truck's headlights illuminated a vague, static shape. At first, John thought it might be some kind of animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a white van standing in the middle of the road. The rear doors were wide open, and a dim light flickered inside, as if it were on the verge of going out. He frowned, confused. The van was completely blocking the passage, and there was no sign of any movement around. John slowed the truck down, cautious, his eyes fixed on the scene ahead. His heart raced a little as he took a closer look at the surreal scene. Something was deeply wrong, but at that moment he still didn't know what. Parking the truck on the roadside, John switched off the engine. The silence that followed was oppressive. The silence after switching off the engine seemed denser than before, as if the very air around John was charged with tension. He looked at the white van in front of him, motionless, with the rear doors still open and that intermittent light inside flashing irregularly. Curiosity began to dominate his thoughts, but it was accompanied by a growing unease. Something was out of place. John hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps it was just a broken-down vehicle, someone in need of help. Or maybe it was something much worse. He knew that the deserted roads of Wyoming could hide mysteries that were best not unraveled. But curiosity was mixed with a strange sense of duty. What if someone really needed help? He couldn't just ignore it and move on. The silence after switching off the engine seemed denser than before, as if the very air around John was charged with tension. He looked at the white van in front of him, motionless, with the rear doors still open and that intermittent light inside flashing irregularly. Curiosity began to dominate his thoughts, but it was accompanied by a growing unease. Something was out of place. John hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps it was just a broken-down vehicle, someone in need of help. Or maybe it was something much worse. He knew that the deserted roads of Wyoming could hide mysteries that were best not unraveled. But curiosity was mixed with a strange sense of duty. What if someone really needed help? He couldn't just ignore it and move on. He took a deep breath and continued. Curiosity still pushed him forward, even though his instincts told him to get back in the truck and keep going. The silence seemed to intensify, and he could now clearly hear the sound of his own breathing, the accelerated rhythm of his heart. As he approached the back of the van, he shone his flashlight inside. What he saw did not reassure him. The floor of the van was dirty, as if someone had tried to clean something up in a hurry. There were no bodies, but what he did find was disturbing: an open backpack thrown onto the front seat. Inside, a torn notebook and a map, both stained and aged, as if they had been handled many times. John felt a shiver run down his spine. Whoever was in that van couldn't have been far away. He instinctively turned to look towards the forest, but all he saw was darkness. No movement, no sound apart from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet he felt somewhere deep down that he was not alone out there. John felt the weight of the silence around him as he illuminated the van's interior with his flashlight. The feeling of being watched seemed to intensify with every second, but he forced himself to stay focused on what was in front of him. His eyes quickly passed over the seats, the dirty floor, the carelessly thrown objects. Everything seemed to suggest that someone had left the vehicle in a hurry, as if running away from something, or someone. The torn notebook and stained map in his backpack caught his eye. He leaned over and pulled out the notebook, flipping through the pages carefully. There wasn't much writing, just a few indecipherable notes, scribbles and symbols that John didn't recognize. The map also looked old, worn by time, with hand-drawn markings that traced routes to places he didn't know. Something about the combination bothered him deeply, but he couldn't understand what. The flashlight flickered slightly in his hand, not because of a faulty battery, but because of the tension that was beginning to take hold of him. John closed his backpack and took a step back, assessing the scene from a new perspective. Everything indicated that someone had been there, and recently. He looked again at the drag marks on the ground, which stretched towards the forest. The thought of following those marks made his stomach turn. The air around him was heavy, almost suffocating. John turned quickly, trying to catch any movement in the shadows of the trees. The beam of the flashlight passed through the tall bushes, but all he could see was darkness. Even so, he felt he wasn't alone. His senses were on alert, and part of him wanted to get back into the truck and get out of there as quickly as possible. But against all instinct, he decided to keep investigating. Something attracted him, a need to understand what had happened there, even if it meant risking more than he should. Perhaps it was a sense of duty, or maybe just the stubborn curiosity that always pushed him forward in the strangest situations. John moved even closer to the van, illuminating every corner in search of clues. He noticed that the driver's seat was empty, which seemed obvious, but the most disturbing detail was the key still in contact. Who would leave a vehicle abandoned, with the key in place and the doors open in the middle of a deserted road? Increasingly, it seemed part of something bigger, something sinister. As John leaned over to turn off the flashlight and return to the truck, something suddenly stopped him. A pop. It came from the forest. The sound echoed clearly through the night, breaking the oppressive silence. His muscles immediately tensed, and he was paralyzed, listening carefully. It wasn't the wind, that much he knew for sure. The noise was followed by a deep silence, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. John turned his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but all he saw was the dense darkness between the trees. The wind, which until that moment had been calm, seemed to have ceased completely. He knew he had to get out of there, but something was holding him in place. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, the idea that something was lurking, just waiting for him to make a mistake, invaded him. John knew that if he wanted to get out of there safely, he had to act fast. The crack in the forest reverberated through the night, echoing in John's mind like a primal warning. He knew it wasn't his imagination. Something was there, hidden in the darkness, and now it seemed that the silence had become a living presence, watching his every move. For a moment, he was completely paralyzed, as if time had frozen around him. His eyes searched the darkness, and his heart beat irregularly, hammering in his ears. The flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam of light barely able to penetrate the density of the shadows between the trees. John swallowed and took a step back, trying to decide what to do next. The rational part of his mind was screaming at him to get back into the truck and get out of there as quickly as possible. But something, perhaps fear or curiosity, kept him stuck in that place. It was as if leaving the place without understanding what was going on was worse than staying. Another pop, this time closer. John turned his body quickly, the torchlight scanning the trees in the hope of finding what was causing the sound, but there was nothing. The air around him seemed heavier, stifling, and the wind that used to blow lightly had disappeared, leaving everything motionless. He felt isolated in a bubble of silence and darkness, and the sensation of being watched was almost unbearable. Then he heard it. Not a pop, but something much more disturbing: slow, heavy breathing coming from somewhere nearby. There was no denying it. It wasn't natural. John turned again, his body tense, ready to react to anything that emerged from the shadows. But all he could see was the faint glow of his flashlight, illuminating branches and leaves. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice sounding weaker than he expected, almost swallowed up by the darkness. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence that seemed to mock his attempt to find logic in the situation. The tension grew by the second, and John felt the adrenaline coursing through his body, fighting against the paralysis of fear. He knew he couldn't stay there, exposed and vulnerable. The feeling of imminent danger was overwhelming, and finally the survival instinct spoke louder. With quick steps, he began to make his way back to the truck, his eyes still scanning the perimeter without lowering the flashlight. Every crack, every rustle in the trees seemed to be an omen that something was approaching. When he reached the door of the truck, his hand was shaking so much that he almost dropped the flashlight. It was then that he heard a sound that made his heart stop for a second. Footsteps. Clear, steady footsteps, coming up behind him. John turned around slowly, fear paralyzing his muscles, but what he saw made him freeze. At the side of the van, the same hooded figure as before was standing, watching him in silence. The long cloak moved slightly, even though there was no wind. The hood hid its face, but John felt its penetrating gaze, as if he were being dissected by a presence that shouldn't have been there. "You shouldn't have stopped," said the figure, its voice so low that it was almost absorbed by the night. Terror coursed through John's body. The simple words, but loaded with something deep and frightening, hit him like a blow. His mind told him to run, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. He tried to reply, but no words came out of his dry mouth. The figure began to take a step towards him, slowly and deliberately. It was enough for John to finally regain control of his body. He threw himself into the truck, slamming the door hard. His fingers, trembling and sweaty, desperately tried to turn the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled, and without looking back, he stepped on the accelerator, making the truck leap forward with a deafening noise. As the truck picked up speed, John looked in the rearview mirror. The hooded figure was still there, motionless, watching as he drove away. Even from a distance, he could feel its gaze following him, as if it had been marked. The truck's engine roared as John pressed down hard on the accelerator, the weight of the situation pushing him away from that place. His heart beat at a frantic pace, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he focused on the road ahead. The hooded figure continued to haunt his mind, the image engraved in his thoughts like a nightmare he couldn't escape. As the headlights illuminated the dark, endless asphalt, he still glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see that figure come running up behind him. But the rearview mirror showed only the empty road and the blackness of the night. Despite this, John couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't completely free. It was as if the very air around him was heavy, charged with something invisible but threatening. Every bend, every kilometer, he tried to shake off the growing dread that gripped his chest, but the tension wouldn't let up. His thoughts raced as fast as the truck, wondering what had just happened. Who or what was that figure? And what did she want with him? Suddenly, an unexpected sound snapped him out of his reverie. It was a low, almost imperceptible noise coming from somewhere in the cabin. John immediately looked around, trying to identify the source. The sound was like a soft rustle, as if something was moving slowly. His mind was flooded with the memory that, before getting into the truck, he had heard footsteps behind him, and now it seemed to be closer than he had imagined. His gaze went to the interior rearview mirror, aimed at the small curtain that separated the cab from the rest compartment. What he saw made his stomach sink. The curtain swayed slightly, as if it had been touched, but the truck was moving fast, and the windows were closed. There was no wind, nothing that could have caused it to move. John felt the air fail in his lungs as his panic grew. He tried to keep control, telling himself that it could just be the effect of tiredness or accumulated tension. Perhaps he was imagining things. But then the movement of the curtain became more evident. It was subtle but constant, as if someone or something was moving behind it. John stared at the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He knew he had to keep driving, but growing fear forced him to look at the curtain again. He didn't want to find out what was there, but dark curiosity overwhelmed him. Taking a deep breath, John did the unthinkable. With a trembling hand, he stretched his arm towards the curtain, trying to pull it slightly to reveal what was behind it. As his fingers brushed against the fabric, the truck swerved, and he had to turn his attention back to the road to avoid losing control. The vehicle swayed dangerously before he managed to right it. "Don't do this," he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that ignoring the curtain was the best choice. But the rustling came again, louder this time. It seemed more urgent, more present, as if something or someone wanted his attention. John felt terror seize every fiber of his being, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know. Slowly, he looked back into the inner mirror. His heart almost stopped when he saw the curtain open on its own, revealing a shadow behind it. He quickly looked away, focusing on the road. His mind was screaming at him not to look again, but he knew that whatever it was already with him. There was no escape. Dread paralyzed him, but he needed to get off that road as quickly as possible. Stepping even harder on the accelerator, the truck roared down the deserted road, each second dragging by as he struggled to stay in control. John didn't know what was behind him, but he sensed that the figure he had left on the road had not been left behind. She was with him, inside the truck, and at any moment she could reveal herself completely. Every kilometer he traveled seemed not to be enough to distance himself from that invisible terror. And as he drove towards the dim light of the next town, a terrible realization hit him. No matter where he went, it would follow him. Fear overwhelmed him. He wasn't alone in the truck, and the real terror was yet to reveal itself. John felt the terror pulsing through his veins as the truck sped along the dark road. With every kilometer he traveled, the feeling that something was watching him intensified. The weight of the invisible presence in the rest compartment was palpable, like a shadow he couldn't see, but which was there, lurking. He knew he wasn't alone, and the idea that the hooded figure he had left behind was somehow with him consumed him. The rustling of the curtain behind him had ceased, but the tension remained. John looked in the rearview mirror constantly, but could see no further than the darkness of the cabin. Whatever was there seemed to be hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The air was heavy, oppressive, and he could barely breathe without feeling the pressure of fear in his chest. With the headlights illuminating the road ahead, John spotted what looked like a small town on the horizon. The dim, distant lights brought a spark of hope. If he could get there, maybe he would be safe. Maybe he could understand what was going on, or at least get away from that feeling of being hunted. Accelerating further, the truck's engine rumbled in response, but soon a strange noise began to emerge. It was a low rumble, a kind of wheezing coming from the cab. John looked at the dashboard, trying to identify the source of the sound, but there was nothing wrong with the vehicle. The hissing, however, grew louder, becoming something that sounded like a distant voice. He couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone was whispering. A chill ran up his spine. The whisper grew louder, but he didn't dare look back. His mind told him to keep driving, to ignore it, to pretend nothing was happening. But the sound became clearer, as if that voice was trying to communicate with him. "John?" His name was spoken almost inaudibly, but John heard it clearly. The figure, or whatever it was, knew his name. Adrenaline exploded through his body. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension, and tried to focus only on the road. The city was closer now, maybe only a few minutes away, but he didn't know if he could last that long. The wheezing turned into a low, macabre laugh, as if something was having fun at his expense. It was a sound that made his skin crawl, as if it was getting closer and closer. John couldn't stand it any longer. His eyes went instinctively to the rearview mirror, and then he saw it. In the interior mirror, the curtain was no longer closed. Behind it, a dark shadow began to squirm, as if trying to take shape. It wasn't just a vague presence, but something very real and terrible. The hooded figure stood there, motionless, watching him with an intensity that froze his blood. The eyes, or what he thought were eyes, glowed supernaturally in the darkness. The figure didn't move, but John could feel its power, the imminent threat. He looked away from the mirror, panic taking over. He couldn't stop driving. He couldn't face that thing for another second. His body was shaking, and his breathing was irregular. The laughter stopped. An even more terrifying silence filled the cabin. John knew something was about to happen. It was as if the road itself was waiting for the inevitable outcome. "You will never be alone," the voice whispered again, now louder and clearer, filling the air around him. John squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the absolute terror that overwhelmed him. He had to get to the city. The light of civilization was just ahead, but it seemed that the distance between him and safety never diminished. The road stretched on endlessly. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the headlights, quickly and almost imperceptibly. John tried to maintain control, but his instinct made him jerk the steering wheel hard to the side. The truck swerved violently, and he struggled to keep the vehicle steady. The sound of tires skidding on the road echoed through the night, and for a moment he thought he was going to lose control completely. But miraculously, he managed to right the truck. His heart was pounding so hard that he felt like he was going to explode. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the terror hadn't passed. Finally, the lights of the city were straight ahead. John forced himself to keep his eyes on the road, determined to get there, but the feeling that something was following him was still there, latent. Even with the figure now out of his sight, he knew that the real danger had not disappeared. He entered the city at high speed, his headlights illuminating the deserted streets. Fear still gripped him, but at least now he felt there was a chance of escape. When he finally parked the truck near a gas station, his hands were still shaking uncontrollably. But as he switched off the engine, one last thought hit him like a punch in the stomach. He was no longer alone. John took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling of his hands as the truck's engine stopped. The city lights around him offered a false sense of security, but he knew that the real danger had not yet passed. Silence once again dominated the room, except for the muffled sound of the distant wheezing that never seemed to leave him. Sitting in the cab, he looked around for any sign of movement, but the streets were empty, as if the city was asleep or abandoned. The cold glow of the streetlights contrasted with the impenetrable darkness of the night. John wanted to believe that he was safe there, but what he had seen and heard in the truck made him question everything. The feeling of being watched, of no longer being alone, still haunted him. He turned slowly to look in the rearview mirror once more. The curtain was now closed, perfectly still. He blinked, confused, almost expecting the hooded figure to reappear, but nothing happened. Everything looked exactly as it should, which only added to his discomfort. The fear of the unknown had always been more terrifying than any physical threat, and at that moment, John felt on the verge of losing control. That oppressive silence, that invisible shadow that seemed to follow his footsteps, it was as if he was being hunted by something that couldn't be understood. Leaving the truck, he forced himself down onto the cold floor of the gas station. The light wind was blowing, but it brought with it a feeling of heaviness, as if the air around him was saturated with an invisible presence. He looked around, searching for any sign of life. But the windows of the houses and businesses were dark, and there were no other cars or people in sight. His feet took him instinctively to the gas station's convenience store, hoping that the light inside would calm him down. But as soon as he reached the door, he stopped suddenly. The reflection of something passed his eyes in the glass window. John froze. It was a reflection of him, but something was wrong. There was a shadow behind him, not an object, but the familiar silhouette he had seen on the road. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. The station was completely empty. His mind seemed to be playing tricks on him, and he felt the panic rising again, tightening his chest. The darkness, once just a backdrop, seemed alive now, pulsating, lurking, waiting for the right moment to attack him. "I can't be going mad," he whispered to himself, rubbing his face in a desperate effort to clear his mind. Even so, he felt that the figure was closer than ever. He knew he couldn't simply ignore what was happening, but the truth was that he had no idea how to deal with it. It was something beyond his comprehension, something that challenged everything he understood about the world. John entered the convenience store, his boots making a muffled sound against the tiled floor. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, creating an even more disturbing atmosphere. The station attendant, a tired-looking middle-aged man, barely looked at him as John wandered through the aisles, trying to dispel the feeling that he was being followed. He grabbed a bottle of water and went to the counter, trying to calm down. When the attendant finally looked at him, his eyes narrowed in a confused expression. "Are you all right, friend?" the man asked, his voice sounding worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost." John swallowed. "It's complicated," he replied, his voice weaker than he would have liked. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, feeling the cold sweat. The attendant didn't insist. He just shrugged and continued registering the purchase. But just as John picked up his bottle of water and turned to leave, the man spoke again. "Be careful on the road tonight. Strange things have been happening around here." John stopped, feeling a shiver run up his spine. "What kind of strange things?" he asked, his voice shaking. The attendant looked up, hesitated for a moment before answering. "Disappearances. Drivers who stop for something on the road and then are never seen again. Keep your eyes open." The silence that followed the statement hung heavy in the air. John felt his stomach turn. He knew there was something on the road that night, something he couldn't explain. And now, with the confirmation that others had already faced the same thing, the terror began to deepen. Without replying, John left the store, walking hurriedly back to the truck. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, fearing what he might find inside the cab. He took a deep breath and opened the door at once, illuminating the interior with the outside light of the station. The cab was exactly as he had left it, empty. But in the back of his mind, he knew that feeling of being watched, that invisible presence, was still with him. Something had attached itself to him on that deserted road, and he didn't know how to escape. John climbed back into the truck, locked the door, and took one last look at the road ahead. He knew he had to keep going, but something inside him screamed that the real terror was yet to come. John was back in the truck, the engine running, but something inside him hesitated to go any further. The road ahead, which had once seemed like an ordinary route, had now become a fine line between the known and the unknown, where terror lurked, unseen and insidious. Every muscle in his body was tense, and his mind relived every moment of that dark night. The attendant's warning still echoed in his mind. Drivers who stop for something on the road and then are never seen again. John knew he had stopped. He knew he was no longer alone from that moment on. The city quickly fell behind him as he accelerated the truck. The lights faded, giving way to the increasingly dense darkness of the deserted road. Fear gripped his chest again, and he felt as if he were being dragged into an invisible abyss. He had no choice. He had to keep going. Fleeing was pointless. What was with him was not something you could leave behind. The night seemed darker than ever, and the silence around him was oppressive. The sound of tires on asphalt was the only thing that broke the monotony. The road ahead seemed endless, and the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. John didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. He knew he couldn't bear to see what might be there. After a few kilometers, the familiar squeak came again, soft at first, almost like a distant whisper. The voice. That voice that had seemed so low and distant before, now sounded closer, clearer. John. The sound of his name echoed through the cabin. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his mind could no longer ignore what was happening around him. The wheezing turned again into low, dark laughter, as if something was having fun at his expense. "You can't run away," the voice whispered. "He'll always be with you." John felt short of breath. His breath was short, and his body seemed frozen with fear. He looked at the dashboard, at the dim lights that flickered with the vibration of the truck, and then finally he couldn't resist. He looked in the rearview mirror. There it was. The hooded figure, standing in the back seat, motionless but clearly present. The hood hid his face, but John knew that those invisible eyes were fixed on him, watching, waiting. "You should have continued," said the figure, its voice now filled with a gravity that made John's stomach turn. "But you stopped." John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped in that distorted reality, between terror and despair. He wanted to wake up. He wanted it all to be just a nightmare caused by tiredness. But he knew it wasn't. It was real. It was real. The figure leaned forward slightly, and John felt panic take over his body. He forced himself to look away, focusing back on the road, while trying to take a deep breath. The dread was unbearable, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The voice sounded one last time, but this time without the previous softness. It was cold and firm. "You'll never be free." It was enough to shatter any hope he still had. The hooded figure wouldn't disappear, not while he was on the road. John pressed down hard on the accelerator, trying somehow to distance himself from the evil presence, but he knew that it wasn't attached to the place. It was stuck with him. The minutes dragged on like hours, and the road continued endlessly, as if the world around him had stretched out, a maze with no way out. Finally, the first lights of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The darkness slowly gave way to the gentle touch of the sun, but for John, the feeling of relief was short-lived.